This is the Chucker here, 19.9's resident historian, and I'm back with my podcast partner in crime in this 19.9 podcast, Aaron Meyer, who's going to tell us a bit about his latest project, Iconic Seasons, which offers fans a deep dive into one thrilling college basketball season at a time. Aaron's work begins with Iconic Seasons. He's going to start with the historic 1987 season. That began with North Carolina atop the preseason polls, witnessed the meteoric rise of a player from the Naval Academy of all places, and ended with Indiana claiming its fifth national title on one of the championship game's most iconic, memorable shots. Aaron, it's cool to be back in the podcast world with you.
Man, it's great to be back in the saddle here. The NBA season, we were just talking before we started about our Chicago Bulls. I've got all my Bulls gear on. The NCAA season's kicking off soon. Indiana's got an exhibition game tomorrow. Mike Woodson, despite our talented freshman being arrested at Taco Bell last weekend, said that's in the past and he'll be playing. So we are moving forward, and just like the Hoosiers, we're moving on with a new project. So 250 episodes of the 19.9 podcast we did, and got something new on the way. So I'm excited to share some information about it.
Yeah, 219 episodes of the 19.9 podcast.
Yeah.
Wow, we did probably about a quarter of those together, it almost seems. I know. We had
there's
quite a run with that. So let's talk about Iconic Seasons, man. What was your impetus for creating Iconic Seasons? Tell us how it all got started.
Well, you can give a little background to this too, because we had some conversations about this. I think part of it was just thinking about the evolution of the podcast. We were trying to stay up with all the interesting things that 19.9 was releasing, and trying to find a way to bring a focus to some of the interviews. And my original idea was around the 1979 season, Magic and Larry, and there may be a possibility that could be a future season still. But as I dug into it and had some conversations with you, we had some content that we were able to kind of upcycle into more fleshed out episodes with some expanded narration and some clips in the background to help tell the story. And I think it just started to come together around that 1987 Final Four. We had done some of those interviews, and I had a few planned. Joe Hillman, who is the sixth man on that Indiana Hoosiers team, was really giving of his time and willing to take us behind the scenes. I mean, he gives some incredible stories that we can get into, just to talk a little bit about some of them. But that's kind of the impetus where the drive came from. We had this podcast that was rolling, and some of the things, as they do, change, and this is a way to extend the life of it with a little bit different brand on it.
I think you're exactly right, man. I mean, one of the things I think we both thought was there was so much great content and so much great energy. When you dug back into the archives and looked at some of these seasons, you would see just all these great little stories. Well, I didn't know that. Oh, I don't remember that. And, for both of us, we were younger in 1987, so it doesn't exist as clearly for us as maybe as it does for others. And then others don't even know about 1987. The interesting thing, that's the first year with the 3-point shot. We're going to talk a little bit about that later and how that kind of changed the thing. Because that was, as I said, first year 3-point shot in the NCAA basketball, 19 feet, 9 inches. That's where the company got the name, of course. But you're exactly right, man. I think when you kind of said, hey, I'd like to do a deep dive in one of the seasons, 79, I think, is certainly a great place to start. And perhaps probably the first season that jumps to mind, because that really sets the stage for modern college basketball in many ways. I mean, that Magic Bird battle in the 79 finals kind of kicks off, I think, how we think about college basketball today as a great national affair and a great national celebration. But then, as we kind of dug in, I said, hey, Aaron, we got these 1987, a lot of pieces already done. I'd already done interviews on the podcast, Tales from the Bench with Ryan Ford, who was a member of the 1987 Providence team that went to the Final Four. Joe Combe was a walk-on the 87 Syracuse squad. So I thought, hey, man, those were two engaging interviews. We had a lot of depth, that we covered a lot of ground. So it seemed like a great place to start. So I'm glad you started with 1987 specifically, because it ends with, again, we'll talk about this later, the most, outside of maybe Jordan's shot, maybe the most memorable shot in college basketball championship game history.
And all the interviews from the guys who didn't win, especially Joe, he can't even watch it. I mean, his story that's in the interview about how he uses it for motivation to this day is just an incredible insight into someone's psyche, and the fact that he turned it into something positive, pretty incredible. But I love that story from his interview.
And before we, dig in too much to specifically to season 1, 1987, take us behind the name of the podcast, Iconic Seasons.
Well, the word iconic seems to just jump out and gives a frame of reference. And again, when the idea came about, it was about that 1979 season. So there's nothing that kind of seared into college basketball fans' memories more than that. If you say Larry and Magic, I'd say a lot of people think of the Celtics and Lakers, but I don't think that you can think of them and not also think of the Michigan State, Indiana State championship game. And so it's just an extension of that. And I think that it could go in a lot of different directions too, talking about, there's just a lot of stories out there to tell. That's what 99 is so good about too. What I enjoyed so much in being part of the 99 podcast was the opportunity to retell those stories or find ways to tell those stories again, because they're just so much fun to relive. I mean, one of the favorite things that I would encourage people to do if they love the 1987 season and they were younger like you and I were, it's just so much fun to ask people who are a little bit older than you or family members about, hey, what do you remember about that? And you guarantee you're going to get their version of the story. Where were they at? What were they doing? And we get the opportunity to ask people who were there, so you get the firsthand story. What was the experience like? And that's just another layer. So I think it's just an awesome opportunity to pick out a season to deep dive into, to look for to the audio clips that help to tell the story. It gives a texture to the interviews where it cuts away to Rick Pitino talking or to Jim Boeheim or Bobby Knight, and then kind of intersperse that with our interviews to give it a different feel and to give it a liveliness that we had in some of the shorts. So you and I were doing the 99 shorts where you would do a smaller version of this. You had a narrated transcript, and I would find different clips to kind of intersperse in there to help give it a different pacing and a different feel. And I think it really worked, and it just gave me the idea to expand that into full-length episodes and then a season eventually.
Well, I'm not going to lie. I'm very biased because I created 99 shorts. I did love those. But, one of the things I think you did awesome, just awesome in this project, you was kind of putting it together, is those interviews that we did that lived on the 19.9 podcast. Yeah. You bring some of those great kind of sound bites out that help tell a full story, but then you kind of bring in all these kind of archival information. And it's so rich in the moment because you're getting Pitino commenting on the 1987 Providence squad, from a post-game press conference. But then we have this rich reflection of guys who were there on the team talking about something, almost 40 years old. And so we get this rich reflection from the contemporary interviews, this rich kind of raw stuff from the past. And I think that the blend that you put to do and how you kind of splice these together and kind of massage it all together, I think was just freaking awesome, to be honest. It was really cool to kind of get to that. So let's kind of dive a little bit more into that. Give people a general sense of what season 1 of Iconic Seasons 1987, what does it look like?
Yeah, well, I got to give you a shout out to start out with one of your
I'll take it.
Yeah, your narrated blog. So you wrote a blog about New Orleans Final Fours, and just so we start out, and this episode's going to be free to everybody. We're going to do it on Patreon and subscription on Buzzsprout, but the first episode everybody can get along with this one, of course. But you go through the history of the New Orleans Final Four. So you got Jordan's shot in 82. You've got this season, 87. You've got Kansas.
1992.
Yeah, you've got Syracuse. Yeah, the timeout. You've got Syracuse returning to the Superdome to get their championship. So there's just a lot of history to explore there. And then we go into, we wanted to talk about the origin story for this Indiana Hoosiers team. So we take a kind of side trip to the seasons prior to 1987, looking at the big trip where they went overseas to China to play all these games, and to Japan and to Europe and played Arvydas Sabonis. And then the year before they win the championship, they lose in the first round. Both Syracuse and Indiana are upset in the first round of the NCAA tournament. So looking at how those losses may perhaps propelled the teams and crafted the decisions that the coaches made heading into those games and those situations where they had to make adjustments or take risks that they might not have otherwise taken. And then after that, it goes into kind of a tick-tock where we have those interviews that are with the storytelling of the season. We start off with Providence and Syracuse and have those interviews and the narrative content talking about their seasons and kind of celebrating those teams. And then we break down the Syracuse Providence Final Four game. And I used one of my other contributors, Robert Wire, helped me to rewatch these games and talk about kind of rewatchable style, breaking down each of the moments in the games. Then we flip back over to the storytelling episodes where we'll have an interview with Freddie Banks, who is one of the starters for UNLV, and Joe Hillman, sixth man for IU, and do the kind of season storytelling for both IU and UNLV. Then we do the UNLV game recap, the IU UNLV game recap with Robert and I plus Joe Hillman. Then the championship game, same thing. Joe Hillman came back a third time, which was really wonderful of him and just gives us that behind the scenes look at everything while we're breaking down the game as well. And we wrap up with the final episode just kind of recapping our thoughts on putting it all together and going through it, and my thoughts on putting it all together. We also have kind of a preview of what could be season 2 with an interview with a local author who's writing a book about Larry Bird's time in high school, and start to think about him because he starts out, of course, at Indiana University and then eventually ends up at Indiana State. So what was his high school years like? How did he end up at Indiana State when he first committed to IU and actually started at IU? So really kind of goes full circle, but I think if you stick with it, it will definitely make you feel like you lived it if you didn't, and if you did get to live it, you'll certainly find some things that connect back to your own memories.
And I think the depth you get on these episodes because of it's not just reading a box score. We're getting depth from people who were there in the arena. And I think that depth and that richness is so critical to kind of telling a season that was iconic, right?
Yeah.
So Smart's jumper over Syracuse, that is the moment that is ingrained in many fans' minds. When you think of the 87 season or you hear 1987 NCAA basketball, I think a lot of people are going to go to Smart's baseline jumper over Syracuse for the Hoosiers to win the national title. But what are some of the maybe forgotten gems of 1987 that you're really excited to share with listeners?
Well, I think you hit on it, talking about 1987 being the first year of the 3-point line, and you can just see people figuring it out in real time. I mean, Pitino
better than Providence.
Exactly. Well, Pitino comes back from the pros where they've got it, and all of a sudden he unleashes this weapon on the NCAA. Billy Donovan, who is maybe a middle of the road talent prior to that, or viewed that way, becomes a superstar, a generational star at Providence, and Billy the Kid, and they just have this run. So I think it's so much fun to watch how they use it. And Freddie Banks' record for 3-pointers stood for, along with one other player at Loyola Marymount, they're 1 and 2 still to this day. So it's crazy to think about that those records from 1987 still today. And the point guard for UNLV, his record was just broken by the Kansas State point guard this in 2023. So the magnitude of these games pretty incredible considering how long ago it happened. I think it speaks to the level of talent on these teams because players stayed longer. I think it speaks to the elite nature of all these coaches. To have that level of coaching talent in one Final Four is pretty incredible. Every one of those coaches, Hall of Fame coaches, every one of them has an NCAA title. Just crazy that doesn't happen anymore, and speaks to kind of where college basketball was at the time.
You hit on a few things there that are interesting to me. One is Providence kind of taking full advantage of the 3-point line in a way no one else at that time was, because it was brand new. Pitino coming from the pros, as you say, that kind of really sets the stage for Providence to play differently than everyone else and really kind of thrust them into the national spotlight, because they were that team in the Big East that hadn't quite cracked through, because the Big East has a lot of success in the 1980s. Sticking with the Big East, I think about 1987, Syracuse at that point is kind of trying to push its way. You know, they were on the cusp. They had Pearl, and Pearl gave them this kind of national notoriety, but they couldn't break through. And it seemed that one night in New Orleans, they were about to break through. And then Bobby Knight in Indiana pushed that to the end. You think about Tark the Shark, you know, a mid-major program bringing UNLV to the Final Four and kind of establishing that school and that program as a major player in the national scene. That really sets the stage for the success they have in 19. And you think about, four coaches in the Final Four, all in the Hall of Fame, all win national titles. It's a wild thing. And then, you know, on the backdrop of that, you brought up as well, Indiana ends the 1986 season losing in the first round at Cleveland State.
Syracuse too loses in the first round. So the two teams in the championship game lost in the first round the year before.
But specifically that Indiana lost. I mean, yes. And it almost to me kind of brings to mind Virginia after, you know, because that loss against Cleveland State for Indiana was very embarrassing.
I agree.
Very embarrassing. And that's just not something Indiana did. They lost, especially under Bobby Knight. Hey, the greatest coach in America. What's he doing losing in the first round to Cleveland State? And he did. And it almost calls to mind when Virginia lost to UMBC and as the one seed a few years back, and just the resolve those guys showed, Virginia that is, to take that very embarrassing loss, the first with resolve and persistence to make it back to the national title game and win the title. I think Indiana's has a very similar story. So I think 1987, when you think about the major players, not just on the court, the coaches as well, and just how that season really progresses and ends in New Orleans, it's pretty remarkable. And I think that's why, to me, it's an awesome season to start with. Pretty cool season to stage for the modern game the way it is played. I think 1979, in my opinion, sets the stage for the modern, meaning college basketball being something that the national audience gravitates to. I think I would argue 1979 has the title there. But to me, 1987, when you think about the energy and how the game is played, the 87 season, I think, kind of is kind of the forecast what we see today in many respects.
Oh, well, I mean, any coach today would love.
How did you decide?
Yeah, I was going to say any coach today would love the IU UNLV game with scores in the 90s, 43s taken by UNLV. Just an absolute incredible game. Rewatching that game, which we'll put links, of course, to all the YouTube so people can rewatch it themselves even prior to the episode. I would recommend people do that because it's just fun to be able to, again, add another layer to really watch the game if you've never seen it. It is, it comes alive with like many games today don't, just because, again, at the college basketball level, you don't get that elite level of talent and the camaraderie between the players. Everybody's been there for years. The coaches are stalwarts and locked into their systems. They're a top status poll, I guess, their respective universities, and kind of shows in the way that the players carry themselves and the way that the games roll out. Yeah.
So you teased this a bit earlier. The last season, or I should say the last episode of the first season of Iconic Seasons, teases a little bit of 1979. So tell me about the plans you have. I mean, you've only put this first season to bed here of Iconic Season. Tell me about the plans you have moving forward for Iconic Seasons.
Yeah, I'd love to, depending on how this season goes, depending on the feedback that we get. So, people enjoy it. Please, subscribe to the season, get on Patreon. They'll be able to read the intros there to see what the episodes are about, and then to get in there and become a patron, and hopefully it leads to a second season. But I would like to be able to fund the second season. We had some initial discussions, I think you and I, about what it would be like, but it just takes more research to do. I'd like to do the entire year and some of the backstory. So what we get into in the last episode is a bit of the backstory about Larry Bird, and I think there's an untold story about him that is so little known outside of my little corner of Indiana, maybe, where they know what Springs Valley is about. They know what Indiana basketball is about, especially in that era. We talk a little bit about what his high school career was like, how that led to who he was as a person. And it was funny to see in the HBO show. I don't know if you saw any of that, the Lakers show that was on. They had kind of a Larry Bird portion of that, and they tell a little bit of the story, or a version of that story, in about 2 minutes. But it is incredible to learn about, and Magic Johnson too. I think just where he comes from in Lansing, his family, and the way he carries himself at Michigan State and leads them to that championship. I just think there's a real opportunity to tell the story of that entire season. So I'd like to start a little bit even before how Magic and Larry got to Michigan State and Indiana State, and then talk about how the season progresses throughout the season, and then focus in again eventually on the Final Four.
So one of the cool things here is, I think you're teasing the ability of going from 1987, or the possibility, I should say, of going from 1987 back to 1979. And who knows if there's future Iconic Seasons, maybe we're jumping forward to, 1992. It's a cast of characters. But by 10, 15 years, there's connection points with these multiple seasons, whether it be kind of the same characters because players stayed longer. These connection points that, even though there may be 8, 10, 12 years in between things, there's these awesome narratives I think you can tell that connect seasons together that allow you to jump forward or backward accordingly with Iconic Season. So I'm really excited for what's to come here, man.
I hope that the Syracuse people, really promote this, and they'll want us to do Iconic Seasons 2003 with Melo and give them a different ending to the year.
Yeah, the big breakthrough in Boeheim's redemption, no question. So, and you think about this. This is just a connection that comes to mind. One of the most memorable shots in championship game history happens against Syracuse.
Yep.
Quite arguably the most iconic defensive play in championship game history. Hakeem Warwick blocking that shot in the corner happens with Syracuse. So some cool stuff happens there, and maybe we can tease those Syracuse people. If they're not too angry reliving the 1987 season, maybe we can bring them back to the 2003 season.
That's right.
Obviously, the Orange got a great fan base here, so let's hope we can do that. So, well, Aaron, it's always been a fun ride with you, man. I appreciate you being my partner in crime on the 1990 podcast for all these many years. I'm really psyched that you're doing this new project and really taking, I think, some of the awesome work I think we did. That's patting ourselves on the back, I guess. But, hey, man, we're two college basketball fans.
That's right.
Who I think knew there was richness in going more in depth to stories and extracting the archives. And I know that's kind of a lot of what I did was the deep research on stuff. And then getting to have conversations with people where we could get more than the box score or get more than what YouTube might tell us. Even if we could watch the game, as great as that is, well, what was said in the huddle? Because that's not always what we did get, or what was happening in the locker room. And you hear these just awesome stories. So I'm really proud of the work we did at 99 Podcast. And like I said, I'm really excited that you venturing out on this new project and giving people a deeper dive into some of these awesome campaigns in college basketball history. I think I only scratched the surface of the great stories that were out there, and just getting people back in this moment of remembering some of these great moments in college basketball history. And that's what I think Iconic Seasons is certainly going to do in spades and in depth and with a great richness. So awesome work, Aaron, man. And I'm glad we connected here to give people a glimpse into what's happening with Iconic Seasons.
Much appreciated.